They left her to die in the snow. Sure, no one would save her. Sure, a stranger's choice would change her life forever. Ayita, once the valley's most trusted healer, now lay starving and alone in a broken barn, marking the day since anyone had come. Arizona Territory, the winter of 1879. 3 days without food, a body running out of hours, not miles, in a barn nobody remembered, still stood. Before the last snow of that winter melted, this healer who had saved half the valley would save it again, and the lonely rancher who found her would never be the same man he was before he broke down that door. Stay with this one to the end, because what Ayita does when they come back for her is the reason people still remember the story at all. The wind that night did not simply blow, it hunted. It came down off the high country in long white waves that buried fence lines and wagon roads and every trace that people had ever lived on that stretch of frozen ground. Ranchers who had spent their whole lives on that range knew it as a widowmaker wind, the kind that could take a strong man down between the barn and the house if he wasn't careful. And it had been howling steady for 3 days straight without once letting up, as if the whole sky had decided to join in on what the town of Larkspur Crossing had already started. At the far edge of the Boone Ranch, land stood an old line shack of a barn, roof caved in on one corner, walls gray and leaning, the kind of place a man forgets he owns. Inside it, under a drift of rotted hay and a torn wool blanket, a woman curled herself into the smallest shape she could make, trying to keep whatever warmth was left in her body from leaving it. Her name was Ayita, and there had been a time, not so long before, when people rode 2 days just to find her. She had set broken bones with steady hands. She had cooled fevers with willow bark tea and cedar smoke. She had sat through the night with dying children and brought more than one of them back from the edge. Now her lips were split and bleeding. Her hands shook too badly to hold a cup, even if she'd had one, and a hollow, burning ache twisted through her stomach with every breath. 3 days, maybe 4. She had stopped being certain. Hunger did that to a person. It ate the days along with everything else. She had not always been alone in that barn. Her husband, Kewin, had been beside her when the sickness swept through Larkspur Crossing the autumn before, taking 3 children in 11 days. Grief needed somewhere to go, and fear is a coward that always looks for the nearest target. The town had looked at Ayita, the healer who had failed to save those 3, never mind the dozen she'd pulled through, and decided she was easier to blame than a hard winter and bad water. Garrett Voss, who ran the town council the way he ran his ledgers, stood in the square and gave her and Kewin a choice that was no choice. Leave Larkspur Crossing that night and never return, or be tied to the church post and burned for a curse nobody could prove she carried. They ran with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and the cold closing in behind them like a second mob. Kewin's ribs had been broken by men with axe handles before they were ever allowed to leave, and somewhere in the second night of walking, his breathing turned to a sound Ayita would hear for the rest of her life. He did not survive to see a third sunrise. She buried him as well as frozen ground allowed, marked the spot with 2 crossed branches, and dragged herself into the first shelter she found. This barn, this cold, this slow waiting she had come to understand, was its own kind of dying. Before any of that, before the pastor's finger found the birthmark on her collarbone and turned it into a verdict, Ayita had been the kind of healer people crossed 2 days of hard country to reach. Mothers rode in at midnight with croup-choked infants wrapped against the cold. Ranchers brought crushed hands, gangrene starting at the fingertips, wounds gone green and foul that other healers had already given up on. She had learned the craft at her grandmother's knee, boiling cedar and sage into medicine before she'd learned to braid her own hair properly, memorizing which root cooled a fever and which poultice drew infection from a wound. Watching, always watching, the way her grandmother's hands moved with certainty, even when her own still trembled with doubt. By the time she was grown, half the territory knew her name, the way they knew the name of the nearest river, settlers and Apache alike, because sickness did not care which side of a fence a person lived on, and neither, in all her years of practicing, had she. That was what made the accusation cut so deep when it finally came. It was not simply the word curse thrown at her feet like a stone. It was that she had spent her whole life proving healing did not choose sides, had ridden out in storms to save children whose fathers wanted nothing to do with her people, had stitched wounds on men who would not shake her hand afterward, and none of it, not one single night of it, had mattered once the town went looking for someone to blame for a fever no doctor could explain. Fear did not remember gratitude. She had learned that the hardest way there was. Every morning since, she had scratched one more mark into the wall beside her with the edge of a broken knife. 31 marks now stared back at her in the gray light. She reached inside her collar and closed her fingers around the one thing the mob had not taken from her, a small silver pendant, worn smooth that had belonged to her grandmother. A healer before her, and a healer before that, back further than anyone in Larkspur Crossing had bothered to ask. She had promised herself in the first days that she would trade it for food if she ever reached the next town. She understood now that she would never make it that far. Her legs would not carry her 20 steps, let alone 20 miles. She dragged herself inch by inch toward a crack in the barn wall, where the moonlight came through like a blade. Wiping the frost from a gap in the boards with a hand she could barely feel, she looked out at a dark ranch house standing maybe 200 yards off. No smoke at the chimney, no light in any window. It looked as dead as she felt. The wind screamed louder outside like something wounded and furious, and her stomach twisted in reply, a cramp so sharp it stole her breath. For the first time since she had covered Kaywin's grave, tears burned down her frozen face. She wondered, not for the first time that week, whether dying quietly might be a mercy after all the loud, cruel ways this winter had tried to kill her. That was the exact moment the barn door slammed open. Cold air and snow rushed in, ahead of a shape that filled the whole doorway. Broad-shouldered, tall enough to have to duck under the frame, a coil of rope over one arm and a lantern swinging from the other. Ayita's heart slammed so hard against her ribs it hurt. She thought, in the half-second before her mind cleared, that the mob had followed her after all, that this was how it ended. It was not the mob. It was one man alone, snow melting off a heavy sheepskin coat, breath fogging white in the lantern light, an axe handle worn smooth from years of use hanging loose in one hand. He filled the doorway the way a storm fills a canyon, not out of cruelty, she would learn, but simply because that was the shape of him, broad through the shoulders from a decade of fence posts and calving season, and winters spent entirely alone. He had come out to check a fence line that had nothing to do with her at all, had heard something small and human moving in a barn he hadn't set foot in for a year, and had come in expecting a lost calf or a fox denned up out of the weather. "Who's in here?" His voice was rough with cold, not cruelty, a voice used to talking to cattle and weather more than people. This is Boone land. Nobody's supposed to be out here. Ayita pressed herself against the wall, too weak to do more than whisper, "Please, I have nowhere else." He crossed the barn in 3 long strides and crouched in front of her, lantern raised, and whatever hardness had been in his face when he came through that door simply fell away. He saw her hollow cheeks. He saw her shaking hands. He saw the wall behind her, 31 small cuts deep. His name was Silas Boone, and he had lived alone on this stretch of range for 6 years, ever since his father died and left him 300 head of cattle and a house too big for one man's silence. He set the lantern down, shrugged the rope off his shoulder, and reached into his coat for the biscuit and dried beef he'd packed that morning and never eaten. He broke off a piece no bigger than a coin and held it out. "Small bites. Your stomach's forgotten how. Go slow or it'll come right back up." She took it with fingers that would not stop trembling, and the first taste of food in 3 days hit her like a struck match, painful and wonderful in the same breath. Silas watched her eat in the lantern light without a word, standing so his own body blocked most of the wind coming through the broken wall. "My cabin's not 2 miles. Fire's still hot. There's more than this waiting there. If you can walk it, I'll carry you if you can't." She looked up at this stranger who had broken into a barn on his own land, expecting nothing, and found a half-dead woman instead. And something in her chest that had been frozen for 11 days cracked just slightly open. She nodded because she could not yet trust her voice, and let him lift her as though she weighed nothing at all. The walk to the ranch house was the longest 2 miles of Ayita's life, and the shortest both at once. By the time Silas kicked the door shut behind them and set her down in a chair pulled close to the hearth, she was shaking too hard from the cold, leaving her body to speak. The fire in that stone fireplace burned low and orange and steady, and the warmth of it hit her skin like something remembered from a different life. It was not a grand house. 1 room mostly, a bed against the far wall, a single chair pulled near the hearth, a rifle hung on 2 pegs by the door, a shelf holding exactly 1 cup, 1 plate, 1 bowl. The whole of it built and kept by a man who had clearly never planned on needing more than that. There was a woman's sewing basket on a shelf near the window, dust thick across the lid. The only sign that this house had once held someone besides him. Ayita noticed it, filing it away the way she filed away every small, quiet clue a body gave about the grief it carried. Silas moved around his own kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done everything alone for a long time, ladling broth into a wooden bowl, tearing bread, setting both in front of her without ceremony. "Slow, I mean it. Sip it," he warned again when she reached for the bowl too fast. She obeyed. The broth was plain, beans and salt pork, and not much else, but it tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten in her life. Feeling crept back into her fingers and toes in sharp, stinging waves, and she understood then, fully, how close she had come to never feeling anything again. "Why?" she finally managed, once the shaking had eased enough to let her speak. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Silas sat across from her, the firelight turning the stubble on his jaw copper gold, and was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "When I was 9 years old, my little sister took a fever the doctor in town couldn't break. A woman came through with a healer's pack, Apache, traveling alone, stopped at our place because she heard a child crying. She sat up 3 nights with Rachel, broke that fever with nothing but bark tea and cold cloths and patience." He looked into the fire instead of at Ayita. 2 weeks later, some fool decided the drought that summer was her doing. Ran her off with dogs, I was too young to do anything but watch. I've had 11 years to wish I'd done something else. Ayita stayed quiet. Silence was its own kind of answer, and hers in that moment was a quiet grief for a boy who had spent 11 years wishing he'd been braver. What happened to her? The question came out softer than she meant it. The healer who saved your sister. Don't know. She wrote out that same week and I never heard word of her again. He turned the poker over in his hands, watching the coals shift and settle. For years I made myself believe she just moved on to safer ground. I came back to that thought plenty of nights when sleep wouldn't come. You remind me some of what I remember of her. The way she moved, like nothing about tending the sick was ever a burden to her, even when everyone around her made it one. My grandmother used to say a healer who resents the work has already stopped being one. Ayita managed a small, tired smile. She taught me everything I know out past the eastern ridge, before I could even braid my own hair right. I used to think the whole world worked the way our camp did. You got sick, someone came, you got better, and nobody cared why the person who came looked the way they looked. Took me a long while to learn that wasn't true everywhere. It ought to be. Silas kept his eyes on the fire, quiet and certain, and for a moment neither of them broke the hush. Just watched the flames eat slowly through the new log he'd set on it. I'm not looking for anything from you. He rose and added another log to the fire. Eat, sleep. We'll figure the rest out come morning. He banked the coals low and pulled a second blanket from a trunk near the bed without her asking for one, and did not wait to see whether she believed any of it before he turned in himself. If Ayita's courage is already pulling at you, tap join beside the channel name right now to become a member and help these frontier love stories reach more hearts. She woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, and for one disoriented moment could not remember why she was warm. Silas had already been up for hours by the time she found her legs steady enough to stand. The stock fed, the water hauled, a second larger blanket already laid across the bench she'd slept on, as though he'd noticed sometime in the night that the first one wasn't enough. He did not make a show of any of it. He simply set a cup of coffee in front of her, let her know the fire would hold if she wanted to sit closer to it, and went back out to finish the morning chores like a man who had already decided her staying wasn't a question worth revisiting out loud. By midday, her strength had returned enough that she pushed to help anyway, and though Silas argued briefly that she ought to rest, he gave up quickly enough once he saw the stubborn set of her jaw. The same look, she would later learn, that had once convinced an entire skeptical camp to trust a stranger. She mended a torn shirt while he worked the horses, and somewhere in the quiet, ordinary rhythm of that first full day, something settled between them that neither one had words for yet. Not quite trust, not quite anything else, but the beginning shape of both. Sleep came for Ayita faster and deeper than it had in weeks. Curled under a wool blanket on a bench Silas had dragged close to the hearth, the fire's warmth finally reaching all the way into the cold place inside her chest. She did not dream of snow. For the first time since Kaywin died, she dreamed of nothing at all, the deep, dreamless rest of a body that finally believed it was safe. It did not last through the night. A fist pounded the front door hard enough to rattle the hinges, and Ayita came awake with her heart already racing. Silas was up and across the room before the second knock landed, moving with the unhurried speed of a man who had faced trouble on his own land before. He looked once at her, then at the rug in the middle of the floor. Cellar, now, Not a sound. Whatever you hear. He was already lifting the trap door hidden beneath it. She dropped into the dark, dirt-smelling space with her heart in her throat, and the trap door closed soft above her just as the front door opened. Boone, a voice she knew too well, even muffled through the floorboards. Garrett Voss, cold and clipped, a man used to being obeyed. We tracked a woman this way, the healer from Larkspur Crossing. You seen her? Seen plenty of things on my own land tonight. None of them your business, Voss. Even through the floor, Ayita could hear how steady his voice stayed. That woman's dangerous. Cursed 3 children into their graves. Funny, last I checked, a hard winter and bad water killed those children. Not a woman with a medicine bag. You planning to search my house without my say-so? Or you planning to get off my porch? Careful, Boone. Man who hides a curse under his roof shares in whatever comes of it. I'll take my chances with a hungry woman over a man who rode 2 hours in this weather to threaten his neighbors. Now state your business or get gone. There was a long, ugly pause. Boots shifting on the wood outside. Low voices arguing among themselves. One of them muttering something about wasted daylight and another quieter, wondering aloud whether they'd even followed the right tracks at all. Ayita pressed her hand flat against the pendant at her throat and did not breathe, counting the seconds the way she had once counted the marks on the barn wall, certain each one might be her last. We'll be back, Boone, with more men next time. Bring the whole county. Answer's not going to change. Now get off my land before I lose my patience with you. Footsteps retreated. A wagon creaked away into the dark. Silence settled over the house like snow settling over a field. And after a long stretch of it, the trap door lifted and Silas reached his hand down into the dark. They're gone. For tonight. Ayita climbed out on legs still weak from 3 days of starving and stood facing him in the low firelight, more afraid now than she had let herself be in the barn. I should go. I've put you in danger just by being under your roof. Silas planted himself between her and the door without seeming to decide to do it. And go where? You won't survive a night out there, and I'm not putting you back into the cold I just pulled you out of. Why does it matter to you? Why fight for a stranger? Because I've seen what fear does when it goes looking for someone to blame. His voice had gone quiet. I watched it happen once already and did nothing. I'm not doing nothing twice. She sank into the chair by the fire, the fight draining out of her all at once, and gave him Kaywin's whole story, his patience, his laugh, the way he had believed in her healing even on the night she doubted it herself, the way he had died with her name in his mouth on a frozen road 2 miles from nowhere. Silas listened without a single interruption, and when she finished, his only response was that she should live in a way that honored that she should not hand Voss a body to add to what he had already taken from her. They sat that way a long while, the fire burning down to embers, neither of them in a hurry to break the quiet that had settled between them. It was not the silence of strangers anymore. Somewhere in the space of one long night, between a barn and a cellar, and a stranger's rough kindness, Ayita realized she had stopped bracing herself against him the way she braced herself against everyone else now. She studied his face in the low light, the tired lines around his eyes, the set of a jaw that had learned to expect trouble and meet it anyway, and understood, with a small ache she did not have a name for yet, that 6 years alone had made this man just as much a stranger to gentleness as her own 11 days had made her a stranger to safety. Neither of them said as much out loud. It did not need saying, not yet. They left before first light, Silas packed dried meat, 2 blankets, and his father's old rifle, and led her north along a game trail through country so thick with pine that the wind lost its teeth. He moved through the forest the way she moved through a sick room, quiet, sure, reading signs she couldn't see. When they stopped to rest, he snared a rabbit and shared the meat without a word about it costing him anything. The country changed as they climbed, the flat scrub of the low range giving way to stands of ponderosa pines so tall they swallowed the sky, granite outcrops streaked white with old snow, the air turning thinner and cleaner with every mile. Ayita's strength returned to her in slow degrees, day by day, the way color returns to a bruise, and with it came something she had not expected to feel again so soon. A kind of wary hope, small and fragile, that she was careful not to trust too quickly. They talked more than either of them meant to in the long stretches between watching the trail for trouble. She described the plants she gathered by starlight because certain roots gave up more of their strength in the dark. He shared the story of his father, a hard, silent man who had never once managed a kind word aloud, but had left him 300 head of cattle in a house that never once felt like it belonged to just one person. Neither of them mentioned what waited for either of them once this journey ended. It was easier for those 2 days to simply exist inside the pine and the cold and each other's company and pretend the rest of the world had temporarily forgotten they existed. Where are we going? The question came on the second day, once her strength had returned enough to wonder about more than just staying upright. My mother's people have a winter camp 2 days north of here, in a valley the cold can't quite reach. My grandmother's still living, far as I know. If anyone can keep you safe while this settles, it's her band. Will they take in a stranger? You're not a stranger to healing. That'll matter more to them than it ever mattered in Larkspur Crossing. On the evening of the second day, shapes emerged silently from the tree line. 3 men, rifles low but ready, watching the 2 travelers with the careful stillness of people used to strangers, meaning trouble. Silas addressed them in a language Ayita did not know, low and unhurried, and after a tense moment the rifles lowered. They'll walk us in. The elders decide from there. The camp sat tucked into a sheltered fold of the mountains, lodges glowing amber from the fires inside, smoke rising straight up into a windless sky, the smell of pine and roasting meat thick in the cold air. Faces turned to watch them pass, curious rather than hostile, and Ayita felt the weight of that difference in her chest like something almost forgotten. An old woman stepped from the largest lodge, spine straight as a lodgepole pine despite her years, silver braids catching the firelight, eyes that seemed to weigh Ayita's whole life in a single look. Silas bowed his head. Grandmother Nasha. The old woman studied Ayita for a long moment, then addressed her low and unhurried, and Silas translated beside her. She wanted to know what burden Ayita carried into her camp. Tell her I healed the sick and they named it a curse. Tell her I buried my husband in frozen ground because the town needed someone to blame for a hard winter, and I was the one standing closest. Grandmother Nasha listened to the translation, and then unexpectedly she laughed, not cruelly but warm and low. The laugh of someone who had heard this exact story 100 times across 100 years and was tired of it never changing. Only frightened, foolish people fear the ones who heal them, was all the old woman needed to say. Ayita could stay as long as she needed. She reached out then and pressed 2 fingers gently against the silver pendant still hanging at Ayita's throat. Studying the worn old metal a long moment before speaking again, softer this time, almost to herself. She says your grandmother's spirit walked a long way with you to bring you here. Silas translated, his voice unusually careful, as though he understood these words mattered more than most. She says a healer never truly loses the ones who taught her, not even in a barn, not even in the snow. She says you carried your grandmother the whole way, whether you knew it or not. Ayita had not cried since the night she buried Kewin, had convinced herself there was no room left in her for it between the walking and the starving and the surviving. She cried then, quietly in front of strangers who had become, in the space of one evening, considerably less strange than the town she had left behind. And nobody in that fire-lit lodge thought any less of her for it. Grandmother Nesha only nodded, satisfied, as though tears were simply further proof of exactly what she'd already decided about the woman kneeling in front of her. That night, Ayita slept inside a warm lodge surrounded by people who did not fear her. And for the first time since Kewin's death, her dreams held no snow and no hunger at all. Only the sound of a fire, and somewhere close by, the quiet, steady breathing of a man who had chosen, without anyone asking twice, to stand between her and the cold. The days that followed passed easier than any Ayita had known, since the fever first took hold of Larkspur Crossing. Grandmother Nesha kept her close, walking her through the winter camp's stores of dried roots and bark, comparing methods, correcting a grip here, praising a steady hand there, the two of them trading knowledge across a language gap that mattered less with every passing hour. On the third morning, a young mother brought a boy with a swollen, infected splinter buried deep in his palm, and Ayita worked it free with a heated needle while Nasha gave quiet instruction, and the boy's mother watched, wide-eyed, the fear in her face slowly softening into something like trust. By that evening, half the camp knew the newcomer's hands were steady, and her medicine was true, and the wary looks that had followed her that first night thinned into simple curiosity, then warmth. Silas found reasons to stay near the fire where she worked more often than the cold alone accounted for. He mended harness leather he didn't need to mend. He split more firewood than the camp could burn in a week. Once, catching her watching him do it, he only shrugged, unable to explain even to himself why 6 years of solitude suddenly felt like something he was in a hurry to set down. Neither of them named what was growing between them in that sheltered valley. There was too much unfinished behind them for that, and both of them knew it, but it sat there anyway, patient and warm, in every glance that lingered a beat too long, and every silence that no longer felt like it needed filling. Before the storm in this story breaks wide open, tap join beside the channel name to become a member of this channel. You will not want to miss what Ayita does next. Peace, when it finally arrived, did not last as long as either of them wanted it to. 2 days into what had begun to feel like healing, Silas returned from a scouting ride with his jaw set hard and his eyes carrying bad news before he managed a single word. Cattle are dropping dead in Larkspur Crossing. 2 children took sick yesterday. High fever, same as the sickness that killed the first 3 last fall. Voss is telling anyone who'll listen that it's you, that you curse the whole town from up here in the mountains out of spite. Ayita's hand went still over the medicine pouch she had been sorting through. Herbs grandmother Nasha had helped her gather over the past days. It isn't a curse. Her mind worked slowly back through everything she had seen the autumn before. The metallic taste in the well water near the creek. The way the sickness always started closest to the water's edge. I saw signs of this before, and no one would listen. It's the creek. Something upstream is poisoning it. They're gathering at the church with rope, torches. Voss is leading them here by morning if we don't do something first. Fear rose fast and cold in her chest, the same fear that had once sent her running into a barn to die alone. But it did not take hold of her the way it once might have. "Then I have to face them," she said, "before more children die of something that isn't me." "They won't listen to you, Ayita. Not after everything Voss has poured into their ears." "They'll listen if I can prove it," she said, standing straighter than she had since the night Silas found her. "And I can. Winter tried to kill me in that barn, and it didn't finish the job. I'm not going to let fear finish it now." Silas looked at her for a long moment, something new and fierce moving behind his eyes, and then he reached for his rifle. "Then we go together. I'm not standing behind you this time. I'm standing beside you." They rode back into Larkspur Crossing 2 mornings later, rain turning the last of the snow to gray slush under the horses' hooves, and found the church square already filling with torches that hissed and struggled against the wet. Voss stood in the front of the crowd like a man who had rehearsed this moment, and when Ayita rode into view beside Silas Boone, his face twisted somewhere between triumph and fury. "There she is, the witch who cursed our children, riding in with the fool who's been hiding her." Rain plastered Ayita's hair to her face as she dismounted and stepped forward, chin level, hands steady in a way they had not been steady in that barn 11 days before. Silas swung down beside her, rifle held loose but visible, and though he said nothing, the crowd's eyes flicked toward him and stayed there a beat longer than they needed to. Whatever they had planned to do with rope, none of them seemed eager to do it in front of a man they all knew could and would put a bullet through the first rope thrown. "I'm not hiding," Ayita said, her voice carrying despite the storm. "I came back because your children are sick, and I know why." Laughter broke through the crowd, sharp and ugly. "You expect us to believe that? After what you did to this town?" "I didn't do anything to this town," Ayita said. "Your water did. The mining camp upstream at Iron Vein has been dumping waste into the creek for months. It poisons the animals first. That's why your cattle are dying. And then it poisons the children who drink from wells fed by that same creek. It killed 3 children last fall. It is not a curse. It is mercury in your water, and it will keep killing until someone stops drinking from that creek." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. A few faces that had been certain a moment before now looked less sure. The same faces, Ayita noticed, that had once come to her door for cough remedies and sprained wrists. Faces she had known for years before fear rearranged them into strangers. An old rancher near the front, a man whose hip she had once set after a fall from a wagon, lowered his torch slightly, as if the weight of it had only just occurred to him. The town's reverend pushed forward from the edge of the torchlight. "If this is true, how do we know it, and how do we stop it?" "Test the water," Ayita said. "Stop drawing from the creek today. Use the east spring instead, the one that runs off the high rock, not the low ground near the mine. You will see the sickness fade within days, and you will see I had nothing to gain by lying to a town that already tried to burn me for the truth." "How does a healer know about mining waste?" Voss shot back, sensing the crowd shifting under him and not liking it. This is exactly the kind of clever story a curse would invent to save its own skin. "Because I watched 3 children die last fall and refused to believe a hard winter was reason enough," Ayita answered, unflinching. "I tested that water myself in secret, weeks ago, after I noticed the fish in the shallows had stopped coming up for insects the way they always had. I found metal shavings and sludge 1/2 mile upstream from the very mine you own shares in, Mr. Voss. Ask yourself, in front of all these people, Why a healer accused of a curse would bother learning something like that at all, if not because she still cared what happened to a town that had already turned against her. The square went very quiet at that. Even the rain seemed to ease, if only for a moment. A man near the back, one whose child lay fevered at home, spoke up in a rough, uncertain voice. "The symptoms fit what my boy's got. Fits exactly." Voss lunged forward, red-faced, rope still coiled over his shoulder. "She's lying to save her own skin. Don't listen to—" He never finished. A half-starved dog burst from beneath the church steps, the same stray Ayita had once splinted a broken leg for, months before any of this began, and drove itself straight into Voss's shins, sending him sprawling face first into the mud. Torches scattered. Men shouted. For one chaotic moment, the whole square dissolved into confusion, fear turning inward on itself instead of outward at Ayita for the first time in 11 days. "Enough!" The Reverend's voice cut through the noise like a bell. "We will test the water before anyone raises a hand against this woman again." By dawn, 3 feverish children lay wrapped in blankets inside Silas Boone's ranch house, the same house that had sheltered Ayita from the cold 11 nights before, now filled with the low murmur of frightened mothers and the steady, patient work of a healer finally allowed to heal. Ayita worked without rest through that long day, brewing willow bark tea to break the fevers, mixing cooling poultices, sitting with each small hand in hers and speaking in the same calm voice she had once used with Kaywin, promising the parents who had wanted her dead just days before that their children would see the other side of this sickness. The youngest of the 3, a girl no older than 6 named Callie, took a turn for the worse near midnight, her fever climbing instead of breaking, her small chest working too hard for breath, her mother sobbing quietly in the corner with a rosary wound through her fingers. Ayita did not let the fear in the room reach her hands. She packed the girl in cool cloths, forced sips of bark tea past cracked lips 1 spoonful at a time, and sat through the worst of it without once looking away. The way she had sat with Kaywin on that frozen road and failed to save him. The way she was determined, with everything left in her, not to fail this time. Just before dawn, the fever broke at last, sweat soaking through the blankets, Callie's breathing easing into something slow and even, and her mother's sobbing changed in an instant, from grief to something closer to disbelief. Silas stayed close through all of it, fetching clean water from the east spring, keeping the fire fed, standing watch at the door, not because anyone threatened her now, but because 6 years of solitude had taught him he no longer wanted to be anywhere she wasn't. If stories like Ayita and Silas's keep you coming back, tap join beside the channel name to become a member today. It truly helps this small channel grow. By the 4th day, every fever in that ranch house had broken. By the 6th, writers returned from the territorial capital with proof that closed the whole matter for good. Assay records showing mercury waste dumped straight into Iron Vein Creek for the better part of a year, and a ledger seized from the mining company's own office, showing regular payments made to one Garrett Voss to keep the town council from asking questions it should have asked months earlier. Voss was gone from Larkspur Crossing within the week, run out by the very people he had once turned against Ayita, and this time nobody stood in the doorway to defend him. Word of Voss's ledger spread through Larkspur Crossing faster than the sickness ever had. Men who had stood in that muddy square with rope and torches came, one by one, to the edge of the Boone Ranch land over the following days, not to threaten this time, but to stand awkwardly at the fence line, hats in their hands, unable to quite meet Ayita's eyes as they thanked her for children who would not have survived without her, or admitted quietly that they had known in their gut all along that a hard winter didn't explain everything, and had said nothing anyway because it was easier to blame a woman than a mining company with money enough to buy silence. Ayita accepted every one of those halting apologies the same way she accepted everything else, without cruelty, without triumph, simply setting each one down like a stone she no longer needed to carry. The Reverend came to the ranch house himself to say what the whole town had been too proud and too frightened to say sooner. Standing awkward in the doorway with his hat in his hands, he told her she had saved them, that after everything the town had done to her, she had still come back and saved them anyway. "I did what a healer does," Ayita replied simply, and there was no bitterness in it at all. Only a tiredness that had finally, after 11 long days, begun to feel like peace instead of grief. That never changed, no matter what this town decided to call me. They offered her a house in town, a formal place among the council, an apology carved into every kindness Larkspur Crossing could think to offer a woman it had once tried to burn. Ayita stood in the muddy square where Voss had once called for rope and looked past the offered house, past the town itself, toward the tree line and the ranch beyond it, and the man waiting there who had never once asked her for anything in return for saving her life. "No," she said gently, "but I will help anyone who comes to me, from this town or any other, or from no town at all. That much I will always do." And she did. Seasons turned. A healing house rose beside Silas Boone's ranch, built log by log with his own hands and filled, shelf by shelf, with everything Ayita knew and everything Grandmother Nasha still had to teach her on the long visits north each spring. People traveled from towns up and down the territory to find her, some still whispering when they arrived, all of them thanking her by the time they left. Every single one of them healed or comforted or simply, finally, believed. Word of the healer at the Boone Ranch spread the way good news rarely does in that country, slowly at first, then all at once. Settlers who had once crossed the street to avoid her now sent their children to learn from her. Apache families from Grandmother Nasha's band came down out of the mountains each summer to trade medicine and stories in equal measure, and more than one wedding was blessed, more than one fever broken, more than one grieving mother comforted inside those log walls before either Ayita or Silas fully understood how completely their small, cautious kindness toward a stranger had reshaped an entire corner of the territory. Larkspur Crossing itself changed slowly around them. The East Spring became the town's only water source by unanimous vote. A new council was elected the following spring, and Callie, the little girl whose fever had broken just before dawn that terrible night, grew up telling anyone who would listen that the healer on the Boone Ranch had personally saved her life, which was, in every way that mattered, entirely true. One evening the following spring, with the sun dropping gold and low over the ranch and the creek running clean again past the willows, Silas took both of Ayita's hands in his and did not let go. "When I found you in that barn, you were 3 days from dying. I've spent every day since being grateful that door didn't open one night later." She smiled, the kind of smile that had not existed in her 11 days before that door opened. "I lived because you stood between me and the cold, and you kept standing there long after you had to. You lived because you decided to," Silas said. "All I did was hand you a reason to keep deciding it." They married that summer beneath open sky, in a ceremony that borrowed from both of their worlds and honored each one. Grandmother Nasha herself rode down out of the mountains for it, silver braids threaded with wildflowers, and stood beside a reverend who had once helped drive Ayita from his own church square. The two of them presiding together over vows spoken in two languages and meant on both sides in exactly the same way. Callie, 7 years old by then and never far from Ayita's skirts on any day that allowed it, scattered petals down the aisle worn into the grass between the ranch house and the healing house beside it. Settlers who had once feared Ayita and Apache kin, who had once been strangers to Silas, sat shoulder to shoulder at the same long tables afterward, sharing the same food, and by the time the sun went down over the ranch that evening, nobody in that gathering would have called any of it strange at all. Only, at long last, exactly the way things should have always been. They had left her to die in the snow that winter, certain no one was coming, certain a woman with a healer's gift and a stolen life had nothing left to give anyone. But a lonely rancher's choice had changed everything, and the healer they abandoned did not just survive that winter. She became the reason half a valley learned, finally, what it looked like to choose courage over fear. And she became, in a barn nobody remembered, still stood, the beginning of a love neither she nor Silas Boone ever stopped choosing, one ordinary morning after another for the rest of their lives.